The first session this afternoon continues what was begun with Juta's talk on the question or the issue that numbers matter, and that as we move from awareness to action, we really need to know and to be able to say to the politicians that we have some serious information about how many people are being victimized, and that also to talk with knowledge, from a knowledge base, about risk factors. So we have 3 very interesting studies that we're going to hear about now. The first, I'm going to call on Corinne Naughton from the Irish National Study. And I might tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I'm most grateful because I had the opportunity in April to convene a session at the European Region Gerontology and Geriatrics Conference, where we did bring together people from these 4 studies. So for some of us, this is our second encounter, and it was designed because the people from the 4 different studies didn't necessarily all know one another. And so we have begun the process of a dialogue between them, so that although some of these studies were 7 countries, the other study was 5 countries, we want to be able to work towards the situation where we do have some commonalities and we can get more countries and more regions that are collaborating. So, Corinne.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Gloria, for inviting me here today to share this information with you. This was a national prevalence study of elder abuse in the Irish Republic, okay, and it was carried out in 2009. This is University College Dublin on a sunny day, which is a very rare thing in Dublin. A little bit about, I suppose, the context of elder abuse within the Republic. It's really a very recent phenomena in terms of its recognition at a government level. In 2002 was really the first, if you like, official report into elder abuse, and then it was very much about the policy and what other countries were doing about elder abuse, and some recommendations that could have been implemented in an Irish context. Again, similar, I think, to this country, elder abuse and mistreatment of older people is very much situated within the context of health and social care. It's directed through the Department of Health and Children in Ireland and through its operational arm, the Health Service Executive. And it has frontline services, dedicated social workers who examine cases of elder abuse, primarily within the community, not the residential sector. The Health Service Executive also funds the National Centre for the Protection of Older People, of which I'm part of that group. So, when a government or a country starts to ask questions about elder abuse, the very first question they ask is, well, do we have it in our country, and how big is that problem? So when you look at the history of elder abuse research, it often starts off with some attempt to estimate the extent. Okay, since 2008, we have collected the reported cases of elder abuse to the social work services, but that, only since 2008. And at that time, in the first year of full statistics, there was about 1,000 cases. This year, there's about 2,000 cases, which comes to the official attention of these services. So about an estimate of 0.03, 0.04%. As we know from other research in this area, that is simply the tip of the iceberg. So when we set out to do the prevalence study, we obviously wanted to make sure that it was an accurate estimate within the Irish population, but we were also very cognizant that we wanted data that we could benchmark against other studies internationally. And we turned to our good neighbours, the UK, who had done this study in 2007. So without any apology, we very closely replicated the criteria and the definitions used in the UK study, which included Northern Ireland. So it was important for us that we had comparable data. So the definition, as Jutta has already said, was very similar to that used in the Abuel study. It was then we were interested in the overall prevalence and the individual prevalence of the different types of abuse. We focused on the incidences in the last 12 months and in community dwelling older people, so it excluded people in residential settings. Again, we were interested in risk profile of both the older person and also the person that the older person had identified as causing the mistreatment. Our definition is that originally produced by in the UK and adopted by the WHO, and we've already heard this: a single or repeated act, lack of appropriate action, occurring in any relationship where there's an expectation of trust, and that's quite important, and that violates the human rights of the older person. So our population were community dwelling, age 65 years or older. We had no upper age limit. And we did not carry out formal tests of cognitive ability. Our particular time period that we were interested in was the last 12 months. This is one of the kind of big contentious issues in the area of elder abuse, is what actually constitutes elder abuse. And we very deliberately used the criteria used in the UK study and in the most recent US studies. One or more incidents of financial abuse in the past 12 months, and we used a number of behavioural types of behaviour. So we asked older people, had anyone pressurised them into changing their will, stolen possessions, forced them to sign over possessions. So we used behavioural criteria. Again, one or more incidents of physical abuse or sexual abuse. Psychological abuse and neglect, a slightly different criteria is used, and it's greater than 10 incidents in the previous 12 months, or any incident that the older person felt had a significant impact on their well-being. So that was an older person's judgment of the situation. And neglect is defined using the activities of daily living. So you first identify if an older person needs help, and if that person and neglect is then deemed to have occurred if there's persistent episodes of unmet need by their primary carer. The position of trust in the Irish study, similar to the UK study and the US studies, was defined as family, close friends, or care workers. Okay. We aim to collect data on 2,000 people, older people living in the community. To do this, we used a multi-stage cluster random probability sample, which meant that we needed to ensure that this population was representative of the older Irish population in terms of geographical location, age, and gender. We used a random route finding methodology, which, some people have concerns around random route finding, but in terms of our budget and time criteria, it was a decision that we had to make. However, it is a very legitimate way of obtaining a random probability sample, and that was our aim. We used quota controls for age and gender because we needed to make sure that we had enough people in the hard-to-reach groups. For example, the over 80s male is typically very underrepresented in this type of population survey. We used face-to-face interviews in the person's own home. All our interviewers were older women, which I think had possibly an impact on our response rates. We used paper questionnaires, so there was no kind of new technology introduced. And we ended up with a response rate of about 83%, which is quite high for this type of study. And I think it was very much down to our selection and training of our interviewers. These were a very non-threatening group of people, because our population, our participants didn't know we were coming. It was cold calling. The interviewer went up to the older person's door, knocked on the door, and can I do an interview with you? So there are a lot of issues around doing this type of research. Okay, I'm going to concentrate really on the results. Anybody needing to find out more about the methodology, just please come and contact me or email me. We were very concerned that it needed to be representative of the Irish population, and we achieved that. And that's really what that slide is telling you. But I'm going to go on to what we really set out to do, which was how big was this problem in Ireland. and we identified that it was about 2.2%. Okay, that's for that 5 types of abuse in the past 12 months. If we extrapolate that to the older population, it would mean that in the last 12 months, there were over 10,000 older Irish people had experienced mistreatment. When we break that down to what were the types of mistreatment, what we found that financial abuse was the most common at 1.3%, followed by psychological abuse. Financial abuse is, in a number of studies in the last years, is turning out to be the most prevalent type of abuse, certainly reported by older people. And if we look this in context, there's currently a study in Ireland, a cohort study in Ireland, looking at growing old in Ireland. And they've interviewed over 8,000 people. And what they found was that 8,000 people, 30% of them were involved in some kind of asset transfers to their family. Okay, so that's 30% of the population. So that's quite a high level, okay, of asset transfer. So, our identification that 1.3% of our population had experienced financial abuse. The question is, when does asset transfer become more than asset transfer? Okay, so our 1.3%, it may be a substantial underestimate, but even at that, 30% of older people are actively involved in transferring assets to their families. Really, there's a lot that we need to ask about that process of asset transfer. And I suppose another point that came out between these two studies, us looking specifically at elder abuse, that other group looking at financial welfare management of older people, that group never wanted to engage with the idea of elder abuse. They didn't want to ask about what proportion of this 30% was not absolutely voluntarily. Okay, so there is a whole part of where researchers, though they are engaged in older people's research, they don't really want to engage or acknowledge that elder abuse can be a legitimate and prevalent aspect of the older population. So that's a message for us as researchers, I think. Anyway, going on, that's my hobby horse. Psychological abuse was the next most prevalent type of mistreatment that we encountered. And really what we found was that a lot of these other types of abuse are occurring concurrently with psychological abuse. Over 25% of the abuse that we identified was clustered. Okay, so, and in particular, psychological abuse was likely to occur along with financial abuse, along with physical abuse. We found quite a low level of neglect, 0.3%, and that, compared to other studies, is quite low. Particularly in the case of the UK study, neglect was the most prevalent type of abuse, so there's a difference there. I can't really explain why we found such a low level. It's quite likely that if you are already debilitated, unwell, you really don't want to participate in a 40 or 50-minute survey. So there is a whole part of where getting this particular population to take part in population surveys is quite difficult. Okay, we looked at the characteristics of older people who had experienced abuse, and what we find is that at baseline, women experience a higher level of abuse or mistreatment than men, and that continues throughout their 70s. But by the time they reach their 80s, what we see is this crossing over, where older men continue to experience quite high levels of mistreatment, but older women, it seems to decline. And this is a pattern which has occurred also in the UK study, and I think also in the US study. So it seems to be a persistent pattern. We looked at other characteristics such as living arrangements, and what we found was that people who were living in the more complex households, where they were sharing the household with adult children, and particularly adult children and their families, were more likely to experience mistreatment than those people living on their own or living just as a couple. We also we looked at 3 types of socioeconomic markers. education, social class, and income. And what we find is this kind of very consistent message. People in lower socioeconomic groups, in the lower income, lower levels of education, experience higher levels of mistreatment. But that's not to say that mistreatment is confined to these groups. That's wrong. That's a misconception. It is throughout all of the groups, but there are certainly higher levels in the lower economic groups, socioeconomic groups. And what we also find is that women are more vulnerable within this context. Health, again, in all of the prevalence studies, health is identified as one of the most persistent risk factors, poor health. And what we find is that it's not just related to neglect. It's not just, the mistreatment is not just through needing help from other people, but people in poor health are also likely to experience financial abuse and psychological abuse. Okay? We found that in particular people in poor mental health were more likely to experience mistreatment compared to those with better stages of mental health or physical health. Okay? And these are cross-sectional studies at a single point in time. I can't tell you which came first, the mental health problems or the abuse, and it is quite likely that it's a feedback mechanisms. Again, a very consistent finding in the last 10 years. All of the prevalence studies have looked at community support. Some using very complex instruments. Our instrument wasn't very complex, it was relatively crude, but there's a strong pattern that those people who have lower social support are much more likely to experience abuse and mistreatment. What we don't understand is how that group came to have poor support, and that's one of the key questions that we need to understand better. How can we prevent this reduction or alienation within families? 5 minutes, okay, I have to hurry up. We did some logistic regression, very small numbers, a lot of statisticians will be running screaming from the room that I do that with this type of data. Anyway, given that, mental health and poor social support remained independent risk factors once you adjusted for age, gender. Perpetrators. In our study, it was predominantly adult children who were identified as the primary perpetrators, and that was both financial abuse and psychological abuse. We found much less partner abuse than in many other studies. Other characteristics of this group were unemployment, and of the perpetrators was unemployment and particular alcohol addiction. You're always very worried when you look at your data set that you've missed out a whole chunk of the data, and really all I'm showing here is alternative definitions, extending the mistreatment definition to wider communities such as neighbours, people known to the older person, had a less than a 1% increase. And again, if you looked at mistreatment since age 65, we only had, it was only 4%. So basically not a large amount of the data excluded based on our definition. Okay, the very important part is that we wanted to be able to compare our data to international data, and particularly, as I said, to the UK. In Ireland, we found 2.2%. In the UK, it was 2.6%. In Northern Ireland, just taking that particular subgroup, it was 2%. So I think our data is very comparable, which is good given that we use the same definition and criteria. That would be much more difficult to explain if we've got very different numbers. But then look across Europe, and the Wells study today, it can be up to 30%. So someplace there are some there's some questions to be answered. Is this just about methods? Is it about true regional differences? Is it about culture, ethnicity? We are still at a not very empowered piece to be able to answer those questions. This just looks more closely at the UK and Irish data. Financial abuse was a little bit less in the UK, psychological abuse. Neglect was the primary type of abuse in the UK study. Again, we need to kind of ask questions around why that pattern is different. And I think there is possibly an opportunity within the UK and the Irish study to be able to do a combined database analysis. Okay, I suppose really I'm going to leave it there. we're, as I said, the National Centre for Protection of Older People. We've got a very good website, thanks to Attracta in the audience. And so it acts as anybody interested in this area of research, I think, it's certainly a useful place to go in terms of collation of international information. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Is there one burning question? Okay, let us go on.
I do have a question.
How did you get ethical committee approval to cold call? I don't think we'd be allowed to do that.
That was, I have to say, the ethics was not the big problem here. We use cold calling because if you advertise that you're going to call to older people's houses, you actually place them more at risk because it's an opportunity for bogus people to call. So when you look at doing these types of studies, cold calling was not a barrier. I mean, obviously we would have had all of these people had proper ID. They'd all contacted the local police in that area and they told them we're about to start interviewing here. The older person can ring up the local police station and verify that you are who you are. And we had all of those safety mechanisms. So it's kind of like a balancing of risk. If you advertise nationwide that you're going to do this type of study, you will be sure that there will be some bogus person who will take advantage of that.
No, but we're not actually allowed to cold call. Our ethics committees won't let us
That's not
do
an
that.
issue. That's still it isn't a no-no within
wonderful.
Ireland. Yeah.
We should be allowed to do this.
Yeah. I think also in Ireland we don't have the kind of registries that you have here. So an alternative to cold call.
Very lucky.
Okay, our next speaker is Lisbeth de Donder from Belgium.
This one?
Yes.
Is it just one?
Yes, just one.
There's a cricket for you as well if you want to.
And I
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be standing here today to present you the results of the AVO study. And AVO is short for the Prevalence Study of Abuse and Violence of Older Women. And you see a whole list of authors there. These are all the colleagues of the whole project, which I like very much to acknowledge here today. So we have done a research project that aims to conduct a prevalence research on violence and abuse against older women, so only older women, in the home setting. So we also excluded people who live in nursing homes, in residential care settings. We wanted to develop a tool for harmonized and comparable surveying because, as we have heard also today, in the one country you find 15%, and in the other country you found 20%, and in the other country you'll find 5%. But you can't, in Dutch we have the saying, you can't compare apples with pears. I don't know if it's the same. So we wanted to have the same tool in the 5 countries. We have done the study in Finland, in Austria, in Belgium, in Lithuania, and in Portugal. And we received funding from the Daphne 3 program. It's the same program as the study that Bridget told us about earlier this morning. So the Daphne 3 program only focuses on violence against women. That's why we only incorporated the prevalence of elder abuse of older women. As you see, we just recently finalized our project. We finished it in April 2011, so there are really fresh data now. We had 5 main research questions throughout the project. First of all, what is the prevalence rate of domestic violence and abuse against older women? Can we detect patterns of violence? Who are then the perpetrators of those acts? We wanted to look at the risk factors. And you see, I did that in italic. That means that I won't be discussing those results today. I think I can dedicate a whole section to that. And then at the end, what are the individual consequences? What happens after people are abused? We incorporated the same 6 types of elder abuse. You're all very familiar with them, but I just wanted to say, when we look at the prevalence rates, it's important to know what we are talking about. So we did physical, psychological, or emotional, sexual, financial neglect, and the violation of personal rights. We developed a questionnaire and piloted it at the end of 2009 among 102 older women. With their feedback, with their comments, with the experiences of a pilot, we adjusted and improved the questionnaire. And basically it's 95% standard questions, and then we had the opportunity for every country to add some additional national questions. So we did a sample of older women living at home. We gathered data from women between 60 and 97. 97 was the oldest woman who filled in our questionnaire. If you want some more information on methodology, I again refer you to the website and to the European report on that website, because I like to have more information on the results. This is the number of people we questioned for each country, and you see at the end we have almost 2,880 older people in the data set. Now, what is the prevalence of elder abuse? What numbers did we find? On the bottom you have the total of 28.1%. So that means that 28.1% experienced at least one form of abuse in the previous 12 months. You see some differences throughout the different countries, with Portugal on top and Lithuania with the lowest prevalence rate. Now, I gave the same speech last week in Belgium on the Flemish Day of World of Elder Abuse, and I saw people in the room saying, "Wow, that's a lot, 28.1%," and I said, "I can read lips, so I have an explanation for that." Approximately. Now I say, let's look at the different types of elder abuse. So the right column is the 28.1%, and then we have the different types of abuse. You see immediately very clearly that emotional and psychological abuse has the highest prevalence rate, on 23.6%. When you look at when you think about the previous study, I think that's the difference. We immediately said it's emotional psychological abuse as from one act. So that's important to keep in mind. And then we have a second, financial abuse, violation of personal rights, you can see it, and then the lowest prevalence rate was for physical abuse. Now, a second thing we wanted to see, okay, these are different numbers, can we see some patterns of violence? And the first pattern we wanted to detect was, do we have kind of coincidence, which types come together? And this is not an easy table, but when you see the diagonal with the fat numbers in bold, you can see things happening only together. So 1.9% of people, of older women, experienced only neglect. 12.8% of older women experienced only emotional abuse. And then you see the combinations of the things that happen together. For example, you see physical abuse and sexual abuse never occur alone. They all always come together with another kind of abuse. And when you see more clear, for example, at physical abuse, you see mainly it doesn't occur never alone, very seldomly with two kind of violations, 2 kinds of abuse, but mainly with 3 or 4 types together. Now, we were not yet satisfied with this pattern alone, and we wanted to think in levels, in different severity levels. We asked the people very concrete behavioral actions, like some approximately the same as throughout other studies. And then we asked, did it happen to you the previous 12 months? And did it happen to you 1 to 6 times, monthly, weekly, or almost daily? And then we can make something like this, and you see the horizontal line. At the left, it means actions who occurred seldom, and seldom we meant we decided to take it as 1 to 6 times a year, and often or very often is as soon as an action or an activity happened monthly or more, it was often. At the vertical line, we call it the density of abuse, how many different things happened. At the top you see different things happened, and on the bottom you see single item form. Then we have different levels. With level 1, notwithstanding that every action of abuse is an action too much, of course, we can call this the least severe level of abuse. 1 thing happened seldomly the past year. Now we have level 2 abuse and level 3 abuse. And level 3 abuse is the most severe. Different kind of action, different items, different forms, all happening very often, weekly, monthly, or more. So throughout the European report, you'll always see we have done, calculated the risk factors for the different levels also. Not looking at abuse, not abuse, but also look at the different risk factors of the most severe level, of the least severe level, etc. Moving on a little bit more. We looked at every kind of abuse for the perpetrators. And in most cases we found it was also the partner of abuse. For example, this is the sexual abuse perpetrator slide. And then you see, and that's also good things may be said, and at the bottom you see paid home help, or the paid caregiver was never, did never act as a sexual abuse. Neglect is mainly done by the daughter, the son-in-law, the children, etc. Now, after the abuse, what did we see? I think most importantly, we also added a scale on quality of life, and you see very clearly that the more people experience abuse, the less quality of life they report. Most important thing is they experience tension, anger, feelings of powerlessness, and those feelings of powerlessness are also important in the next slide, when we see that 55% of the older women say they never talk about the abuse. And then we gave them a whole list of why don't you talk about the abuse, and then it's about nobody can help me, I don't think anyone can do anything about it. Also being fear, having fear of the perpetrator, etc. Now, I think some of the things are already said today. Prevalence don't focus really on the overall or the general prevalence rate of overall abuse, but really look at the different types of elder abuse. We were very much interested in the patterns of abuse, when we see that half of the people who experience abuse experience more than one type of abuse. So more than 14% experiences 2 kinds of abuse together. And 5.8% is really that most severe level of abuse. I'm going to more what is a little summary. But I think in the European report are a whole list of explanations or recommendations and discussion points, but for me one of the most important things is when you look at the different levels of abuse, the 5.8%, of course, there should be lots of attention to that, and we should have interventions for that group of people. And for example, in Flanders, we have things like the police working on the registration center of elder abuse. But people who receive already the help, who take a step to a professional service, are mostly in those 5.8%. But the other percentages are often forgotten about. So we should not only focus on the most severe level of abuse, but let's also work on that active detection of the less severe levels of abuse. For example, by creating awareness among home professionals. If you know that more than half of the people don't talk about the things they encounter, we should actively detect those such people. For example, by developing a screening or using a screening instrument by those home professionals. I was thinking something I wanted to say more about that. That's when we had a discussion last week in Belgium. It was about 5.8%, the most severe level. But that doesn't happen overnight. It's not that, oops, up one day you're in those 5.8 levels. You're really gradually evolving, and let's try to detect more earlier than when they're already in the most severe level. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Well, our next speaker is coming up. It's Pat Brownell from New York. A question I guess I would like to ask, considering that the major difference was in the prevalence of psychological abuse, were your questions similar to those asked in the other studies?
They were quite similar. But regarding, for example, with the Abuel questionnaire, they were somewhat shorter. And I remember Abuel had a really, really long list where he had approximately about 10 actions of psychological abuse. So in the group, we had some quite discussion on it. At what point can you speak of emotional or psychological abuse? And then we said, let's just follow the definition. It's about a single or repeated act. So also a single act we wanted to take into account. So that's why we did that. Thank you.
Okay, which one is it?
2011.
That one?
Um,
That one.
yes.
Yep. Here's the paper.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I have way too much information, so I'm going to click through some of my slides very quickly now that I see how little time my other colleagues have had. I'm reporting on a prevalence and documented case study that we did in New York State. We called it Under the Radar because I think we all have a sense that elder abuse is a hidden problem, and that these studies that are being undertaken and reported on are so exciting because they're really starting to bring this problem to light. The New York State study came out of a recommendation from a New York State summit on elder abuse that we had in 2004. The recommendation was to conduct a statewide research study to define the nature and scope of elder abuse, establish a baseline of prevalence and incidence, and develop a methodology for ongoing data collection and analysis for the purposes of policy planning, program development, and evaluation. And in fact, in 2007, New York State did fund this study. And just as a caveat, New York State is one of about 4 states in the United States that has no mandatory reporting law on elder abuse. So in New York, we had no idea what the incidence or prevalence was. And So this presented both challenges and opportunities. Challenges because there was no single entry point from which to get data, and opportunities in that we could begin to look at many different service systems that might be serving older adults who were abused, and get as comprehensive a sense of the prevalence as possible. Partners, Lifespan of Greater Rochester. If any of you were in Bologna, Paul Kakamis. I presented on the study, and I know I had a wonderful trip with Glory to Florence. Is that Cornell University? Mark Lax, geriatrician, is co-PI affiliated with Cornell. And Jackie Berman, who's the director of research at the New York City Department for the Aging, was the other principal investigator. Members of the research team, I represented Fordham University with a group of graduate students in the Graduate School of Social Service. Cornell University, we had a statistician, and the elder abuse researcher was Carl Pillemer, who many of us know did a seminal study on prevalence. The Cornell Survey Research Institute undertook the self-reported telephone survey of a representative sample of over 4,000 older adults aged 60 and above in New York State. And we had a very large advisory committee who, from all over the state, who advised the study design over the course of the study. We had many collaborators, state and local agencies, regional elder abuse coalitions, local offices of, this is the Aging Service Network, county district attorneys, prosecutors' offices, and community-based agencies. We used the same definitions as the study that was undertaken in, oh, really? So physical abuse, including sexual abuse, psychological abuse, neglect, and financial abuse. And the picture on the far, I guess left is Brooke Astor, a very well-known socialite who sadly was a victim of financial abuse before she passed away. This is the first statewide study in the U.S. to examine the prevalence of elder mistreatment of community dwelling older adults. We did not examine elder abuse in nursing home or institutional settings. We compared self-reported data from the telephone surveys to documented case data over the same secular period. This is 2008. And for a statewide study, I think we had a pretty big sample and developed an instrument, especially for this. These are just some earlier prevalent studies in the U.S. I won't go over that. I'm going to quickly click through the New York State promotional pictures of lovely New York City, how diverse New York State is, and we were able to capture race ethnic data on elder abuse as well. So this is just the size of the New York State and the older adult population, and New York State does have the third largest elder population in the United States. So the aims of the study were to estimate the prevalence of various forms of elder abuse for New Yorkers 60 years of age and older, and we pegged our age to the Older Americans Act, passed in 1965, that defines old age in the U.S. as 60. And this is for the direct interviews through the self-reported prevalence prong of the study, to estimate the number of elder abuse cases coming to the attention of all agencies and programs responsible for serving elder abuse victims in New York State for a one-year period. This was the documented case prong of the study. And to compare the rates of elder abuse in the two component studies, permitting a comparison of known to hidden cases, known meaning cases that agencies had documented in reports as serving, and hidden cases, those cases that were identified through the telephone survey of speaking directly to older adults themselves, determining an estimate of the rate of elder abuse underreporting in New York State. So some of the challenges, diverse geographic regions. New York City is the biggest city in the U.S., and we have some extremely rural areas. Large population, diverse populations. In the county I live in, Queens, New York, I think there's 144 languages spoken. It's a very diverse area, many language groups. So the methodology for the self-reported study, we had created a survey instrument, assembled a representative sample, engaged in the data collection through the Cornell Survey Lab, and addressed issues of subject safety, what will happen if someone who is interviewing an older adult hears something that alarms them over the phone. I'm not going to go over all of the methodology. The report that came out of this study, just hot off the press, as well as this PowerPoint, is posted on the IMPEA website. So anyone who wants to look in more detail, these are just some aspects of the instrument construction for the prevalence study. The financial exploitation, some new items added for physical and psychological abuse. The conflict tactics scale did need to be modified and so forth. And we use some gerontological instruments to assess ADLs and IADLs for neglect assessment. The sample was 4,156. With older adults with 156 proxy interviews. Age ranged from 60 to 101. About one half were married, mean income between 30 and 40,000, and most subjects rated their health as good, very good, or excellent. So for this part of the study, we really probably didn't get at all of the abuse, particularly that might be perpetrated against people who were too impaired to use a telephone. And this just looks at the sample population versus the total population to assess how close the sample was to reflecting the population, another map of New York State. And I'm just going to quickly go through this. The documented case study, again, no one centralized data set or single point of entry, no uniform definition of elder abuse and neglect across the various silos of systems that serve older adults. These are some of the major service systems: Adult Protective Services, the Aging Services, District Attorneys, prosecutors. There were Elder Abuse Coalition members. The New York State Office of Victim Services funded crime victim services programs. There are DV programs, and then law enforcement that collects data on domestic incidents report. And we came up with a minimum data set. And where we felt that this was the minimum kinds of data that we felt all systems that served elder abuse should be collecting. They were not. Total number of unduplicated elder abuse cases. The demographic data on victims included age, gender, household composition, poverty, race, ethnicity. And then the demographic data of abusers, we felt at minimum should include age, gender, and relationship of abuser, type of mistreatment, referral source, and disposition or referral to others. And it was those last two bullets that we used to assess duplication, and we worked with a statistician on a formula to get at duplication, because we knew that one person might move through several systems and so be counted several times, and we had to account for that potential duplication. So we started out, we sent out 419 surveys. Of those, 325 were completed. We had a good response rate. This took a lot of work, I have to say, to get that response rate up. For Adult Protective Services and law enforcement, there was a computerized database, so we were able to get what we thought was 100% response rate, less for law enforcement and less for district attorneys. And altogether, we ended up with 292 agencies. Major findings, good. I was just kidding. So the cumulative prevalence of any form of non-financial elder mistreatment was 46.2 per thousand. So it was high, we felt, based on some of the other prevalence studies done, at least in the U.S. The most common form of mistreatment was major financial exploitation, which was defined as the theft of money or property, using items without permission, impersonation to get access, forcing or misleading to get items such as money, bank cards, accounts, and power of attorney, with a rate of 41 per thousand. And we were surprised that what we were defining as sort of major financial exploitation was reported at a much higher rate than what we thought of as minor financial exploitation. The total incidence rate that we found was 76 per thousand older adults in the past year, that was 2008, for any form of elder abuse, both financial and non-financial. And the study also found that 141 out of 1,000 older New Yorkers had experienced an elder abuse event since turning 60. Adjusting for possible, and this is for the documented case study, just the survey, and we use SurveyMonkey for this. For the documented case study, adjusting for possible duplications of victims served by more than one program, 11,432 victims were included throughout New York, yielding a rate of 3.2 elder abuse victims served per 1,000 older adults. And you can see a huge discrepancy between what was identified through telephone surveys with older adults and what was identified through agencies serving them. The rates varied by region. Urban areas tended to have higher documented case rates than rural counties, and we had some theories for that. And that there were variability in data collection across service systems, and victim non-reporting contributed to the gap between the number of cases reported through the documented case study and the prevalence rates reported through the self-reported study. Emotional psychological abuse is the most common abuse category documented, followed by physical abuse. This is in the documented case study. However, as you can see in the self-reported study, financial abuse was by far the most prevalent form of abuse reported, and this was self-reported by older adults themselves. And on the far, for me, I guess on your right-hand side, the ratio of self-reported to documented for all forms of abuse was for every one case identified by an agency, there were 23.5 cases that were identified, the ratio of 1 to 23. For financial, it was much higher, 1 to 43.9, seriously underreported, it seemed. For physical and sexual abuse, 19.8, neglect, 57.2, very underreported, and for emotional, psychological abuse, 1 in 12. So this is just a regional breakdown, looking at the comparison of documented to self-reported cases. You can see we do have some race ethnic data with the Caucasian older adults identified as more frequently with abuse. Next category was African American, then Asian Pacific Island, Hispanic, Latino, Asian Pacific Islanders, and then other. So, and in terms of abusers, the adult children were by far the more prevalent category of abuser, the largest category of abuser, followed by spouse partner. And this was in the documented case study. In the self-reported study, it was much closer. Still, adult children higher than spouse partner, but you can see that it was much closer. The gender for the documented case study, the majority of abusers were male as opposed to female, and victims, on the other hand, were primarily female. So again, an overview of the demographic information by service system, and then the major overall findings. The study found an elder abuse prevalence rate in New York State that was nearly 24 times greater than the number of cases included within documented data systems throughout New York State. Verbal psychological abuse was the most common form of mistreatment reported by agencies providing data on elder abuse in the documented case study, and this stands in contrast with the results of the self-reported study, in which financial exploitation was the most prevalent form of abuse. And applying the prevalence rates derived from the self-reported study, over 250,000 older adults in the state have been victims of at least one form of elder abuse since turning 60. So that's and some of the study limitations. And I don't know if I have time for implications. But, I don't see my sign. Well, you're out of time. I'm out of time. All right. Thank you. I'm giving this to you.
We're going to change gears a little bit now and talk about the movement towards the UN Convention on the Rights of Older People, and about the activities of INPIA at the UN, and then we'll come back to the issue of consensus and definitions, which is a theme that has run through a number of these studies. So our first speaker will be Ulrike Weidinger from who has a medical degree and a Master's of Science from the University of Vienna and King's College London. And she is INPIA's main representative at the UN in Vienna. And she's the chair of the NGO Committee on Aging there.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'll give you a brief report of what is going on in Vienna on behalf of the NGO Committee on Aging in Vienna, which I chair. First of all, we are having a new UN representative in Vienna, which is Gerontology. You might know her anyway. And she was also elected as our secretary and appointed as the honorary chair. And in Vienna, there is a lot of activities going on, as the European Year of Active Aging and Intergenerational Solidarity is coming up in 2012, as you've heard. And INPIA is actively involved by the NGO Committee, and I'll also take part in the National Steering Committee, which is the next date where we'll meet is on 28th of June, with over 65 stakeholders in Austria. The idea was also to have ambassadors from public life, and there is a long list which was developed with Austrian kind of stars. And we are closely collaborating with Elisa Zechner, who is in charge of the activities around the European Year of Active Aging. The year will start with an event in February 2012, and of course then there will be the new ECE conference for the MIPA plus 10 in September. And the focal points of the European Year of Active Aging will be the aging labor force and retirement, social inclusion, aging and dignity, and policy for all generations. So next point is the MIPA plus 10 ministerial conference in Vienna, which will be organized by the Austrian Ministry of Social Affairs. It will take place from the 18th to the 20th of September with an NGO and research forum on the 18th of September. Dirk Charret and Sasha Sidorenko are in charge of the organization. And on the 19th and 20th, there will be the ministerial conference itself. The topics are so far, which means this is a first draft report, schedule. Living longer, working longer. What are the political, economic, social implications of a longer lifespan? Then the second panel, non-discrimination, participation, and social integration. And finally, creating an enabling environment for health, independence, and aging in dignity. The NGO Committee on Aging is, in addition, planning a side event during that conference, so you will hear about that. In addition, we are planning to have an event for the International Day of Older Persons this year on language and aging. So we'll tackle the issue of communication from various sides and focus on active involvement and participation of older persons. In this aspect, also neglect and abuse of older persons who are not able to articulate or defend themselves will be among the topics that will be addressed. And finally, we are supporting our sister committee in New York in their efforts for a convention on the rights of older persons, and are also in a steady exchange with the Austrian government and try to keep them informed about the ongoing process. And so I hand over to my colleagues. Do you want to introduce them? We'll tell you more about the process of the convention.
We might just mention that, in fact, we have representatives in New York, in Geneva, and in Vienna, so that the activities that she mentioned, in fact, are ×3.
Thank you very much. My name is Bridget Sleep, and I work with Help Age International, and I'm based here in London. And I'm just going to give you a very quick update about the developments towards a convention on the rights of older people within the UN system. As I'm sure you're aware, there are a number of international human rights conventions, including ones that look specifically at particular groups such as children, women, and most recently disabled people. There isn't, however, a convention on the rights of older people. The first time that such a convention was called for was way back in 1948. And interestingly, it was Argentina that was pushing for this and proposing this at that time. And in recent years, it again has been Argentina, along with other Latin American and Caribbean countries, that are calling for a new international convention. The way these types of things get onto the UN agenda is through a system of resolutions, decisions that are made within the General Assembly at the UN. And last year, in October, a resolution was passed to set up a new working group to discuss the protection of older people's rights. It's called the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, and I've put some basic fact sheets about it on the table at the back. So we now have a new working group that provides a forum for a wide range of issues around older people's rights to be discussed. And this channel is there's a potential that a convention can be discussed within this process. It has quite a wide mandate to look at the existing human rights system, the different mechanisms, to identify any gaps within the existing system in relation to the protection of older people's rights, and then to make recommendations about how older people's rights can be better protected. So it doesn't focus specifically on a new convention, but it's possible to discuss that idea within its mandate. It's made up of UN member states, so it's hugely political because it's made up of governments, but civil society is also able to participate. And I think this is very important because the discussions that are had within it can certainly benefit from the experience and expertise, as is being shown here, that civil society has. So I would urge you all to find out more about it and think about how you might get involved. It had its first meeting in April this year, and that looked at the existing mechanisms. And whilst there certainly isn't consensus at the moment between member states about whether there should or should not be a new convention, the idea was put forward and strongly supported by Latin American and Caribbean governments. The second meeting is in August, and it's going to look much more specifically at particular areas of rights rather than looking at the international legal framework. And on the agenda will be a discussion around violence. And so I'm sure that issues that are being discussed here about elder abuse will be raised. The other issues on the agenda, I think, are around the right to social security and then social inclusion and exclusion. It's very much in its early phases. It's hard to tell what it will result in, but certainly it's one of the most important opportunities, I think, at the UN level at least, to discuss older people's rights, and it fills a gap because these discussions have not happened at this level to date. Okay. And as I say, there are some fact sheets at the back with more information and contact details and website addresses for you to find out more. Okay, thank you. Next up.
This is relevant to us because, as you heard in at least one of the studies, of the prevalent studies, they had as a category violation of rights. So what you want to think about is sort of where does abuse fit within the violation of rights, or where does the violation of rights fit within the classifications of abuse? So those are amongst issues that we need to be considering. Our next speaker is Ken Bluestone, who's the International Political and Policy Advisor to Age UK. And he is responsible for Age UK's international influencing work. And a key focus of this work has been on the convention that has resulted in the formation of a coalition that has just changed its name, and it's now called the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People. So Ken has worked for many years in international development policy, including human rights, HIV/AIDS, corporate social responsibility, the roles of the private sector in delivery of water and sanitation, and he's going to tell us today a bit more about that coalition and what it's intending to accomplish.
Right, let's see if I can make technology work. There we go. First go. I think it speaks volumes, the fact that this was supposed to be a session that was just done by 2 people, and it takes 3 of us to fill the shoes of Leah and Susan, so it's a shame they're not here to do this, but we're doing our best. As been mentioned, basically what I want to do is to let you know a bit about the work that Susan and Leah have been doing alongside Bridget and myself. As you can see up there, in total 9 international organizations with international reach that have been collaborating for a number of years now to really try to get this thing moving around a convention. And most importantly, to try to see how can we galvanize support and create a bit of a civil society movement around this. The existence of the open-ended working group has been a real focal point for us and has allowed us to really think about how do we respond, because really this is the first chance that the UN is saying to the rest of the world, okay, let's take this stuff seriously, we want to look at these things, and that actually throws the gauntlet down to us. Well, how do you respond then, as organizations that have been saying for years that these things are important? So that's why we have felt it's essential to be able to respond, and we have created the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People. Now this is the promotional, this is the publicity spot part of the day. You guys are privileged. It's the first time that we're airing our new logo, our new branding, our new colors, and our new name. And our new website, which hasn't gone live yet. So don't try to Google it, or, well, it'd be interesting if anything comes up. It will come up very shortly, and I'll come back to that date in a moment. The key thing here is what we need to create and what we want to provide is a focal point, a way for people who already in our various networks and organizations have seen there's a huge desire to do something around this, and people keep on asking the question, how can we get involved? What can we do? So as the collaborating organizations, we are calling ourselves the steering group. Realistically, we're an interim steering group. We are caretakers for this alliance because this will continue to grow and to develop. So for the moment, we're trying to shepherd it and usher it into its next phase of being. But the key thing is that we are a facilitative group. We are allowing people to get involved. And this, in the first instance, around this upcoming open-ended working group, is getting the information out there, is allowing people to know it and giving people something to focus on to get involved. So you all now have a responsibility for getting that message out too. We want to get this new name, and most importantly, make the website a useful place for people to go for information on the convention, on the rights of older people. And so please do disseminate it. Through the INPEN network, through Susan, we will send out a type of an email that can be disseminated and can go further. One of the things that you may have seen already, and I had to pull these slides together rather quickly, so I didn't get a chance to get another picture of it, but there's a publication that was developed. There's a first collaborative effort of the 9 organizations called Strengthening Older People's Rights towards the UN Convention. This is available on INPEA's website. It's available on a number of different websites. It will be, of course, available on the Global Alliance website when it comes up. What's really useful about this publication right now is it's intended as a resource for promoting dialogue around the convention, giving people an understanding of what are the arguments, what are older people's rights, what are examples of it, giving them a means to engage in leaders, national governments around these things. And that word national is absolutely key for all of this, because even though these discussions are happening in New York at a UN level, the real power and the real decision-making is happening at a national level. So going back to what Bridget said, one of the challenges we face and the imperatives we have is to bring all of these things back down to a national level in any country where we have a presence, so that way the member states, UN member states, actually get involved. They are thinking about these issues themselves, and this is quite critical, get themselves into the open-ended working group meetings themselves. This is important because it's not a given that this discussion at a UN level will continue. It's not a given that this will lead inevitably to a strengthening of older people's rights formally within the UN system. It can only happen if UN member states want it to happen, and they're only going to do that if they think actually they're mandated to do that. There is an imperative to do that by their own citizens. So we need to take action, and the steps are clear. First thing is encourage your government. Please get the message out. Speak to any representatives you have. A particular need is to make sure that we've got better representation of member states from African countries, from Asian countries, and Eastern Europe to be a part of this process. It has to be global for it to really take root. So if you have any contacts, have any ability to engage with national governments in those areas, please do. Engaging in dialogue with policymakers and leaders about older people's rights. Look, a convention is a means to an end. This is going to, we believe, be a very powerful tool for strengthening older people's rights, for addressing things like elder abuse. But in reality, it's a tool for allowing citizens the chance to engage better with their own governments and to create better national policies. That's really what this is about. if we should be trying to achieve that every step of the way. So the very process of dialogue, of talking to governments and talking to our leaders and policymakers about these issues, hopefully will lead to improvements in these areas. Spread the word, please get people thinking about these things, get them talking, and as much as possible, we would like to see as great a presence of civil society at the second open-ended working group meeting in August. The window for doing that is getting narrowly closed. We have until the end of next week for any organization that is not accredited with ECOSOC, with the Economic and Social Council. So if you don't have ECOSOC status, you can still go to the open-ended working group meeting, but you have to apply for that. You have to be accredited, and that deadline is the 24th of June. If you have ECOSOC status, as many of the organizations present here do, you've already accredited to attend the meeting, but you have to register to be a part of it. And that deadline is the 25th of July. So please don't take it for granted. If you have any capacity or ability to be there or have organizations be there, being physically present is actually going to be quite important. Again, we want to make our presence felt, make the member states know that these issues are really vital importance for them as well as for us. And finally, end with the date of when the website is going to come live on, hopefully, fingers crossed, on the 8th of July, which is not enough time to really encourage that uptake of participation at the open-ended working group for non-accredited organizations, but enough time to give as much information as possible to anyone who has an interest in this. And key is, this is the starting point for this. This is going to be a long, long process, and we intend to be around for the duration. This is the beginning of that process. So we hope that rightsalliance.org is going to be a place that people can go, not only in the first instance to get information, but what we want to make it into is a meeting point, a place where people can interact as well who have a common interest in it. And that'll come at the next stage. Thanks very much.
The other UN date that you want to keep in mind is the fact that 2012 will be 10 years since the Second World Assembly on Aging. And so a number of countries will be looking to see what they have accomplished in the 10 years since Madrid. And so for those of us who are in elder abuse work, you know that in the Madrid plan there was a section with some very specific things about elder abuse. So you will want to dust off your Madrid plan and take a look at it and start thinking about how you chat with your government, because there's a number of things that are bubbling up around the UN. And so the more that we can bring those things to work together, the more the opportunity that something real might happen. Our next speaker is Lynn McDonald, and Lynn is going to be speaking to us now before the coffee break and then again after the coffee break, but on two different topics. And she's going to talk to us now about some work that is going on in Canada towards reaching consensus on definitions. And after the break, she's going to be talking about some more practice-oriented, practical tools that can facilitate detection, intervention, and prevention of elder abuse and neglect. And several people this morning did talk about the need for more proactive detection. So after the break, we'll hear that part. Now Lynn is going to talk about the definitions.
Pat, you left your... Oh, but I got it's mine now. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I'm between you and your coffee break. I'll try and hurry. I think I'm out of order as well, but anyway, I will start. What this is a study that grew out of World Elder Abuse Day, so there's always something really good that comes out of this day. And our government in Canada, where we had the World Elder Abuse Day in Ottawa, decided that, wow, we might do something here. So what they did is that they decided that they might start to think about a prevalence study of elder abuse in Canada, in the community, and in the institution. So what they did is they had a competition, and they funded, it's basically a pilot study. And I will say that Canada is not behind, because they did a prevalence study in 1989 where the rate of elder abuse was about 2.2 overall. But it's well out of date, and it's time for something new. So this particular government funded this research project, and what they were really worried about, and actually I think this is the answer to the Irish question. Is it the region? Is it ethnicity and culture? Is it the methodology? And I think the answer that we were working on in Canada is it was the definition, which could be part of the methodology. So this particular project was funded to address the whole problem of conceptual definitions, because we know, all of us in this room know, definitions are a serious problem. Secondly, we also know that we have very serious theoretical issues. We still talk about caregiver stress. We still talk about intergenerational violence. We have absolutely no evidence to back any of that up. We have no evidence for any of the particular theories that we do use. And then, of course, there was the whole issue about risk, and the whole issue that we face. Canada is a very large country with very few people. And so collecting valid and reliable data is really difficult. We had an international research team for a reason. Some of these people are here today, like Ariella Lowenstein and Marie Bayou from Quebec. And we had that because we are very interested in national comparability. I won't go through all the people because it means your coffee. Jane Barrett is who most of you know, is the chair of our advisory committee, who have been absolutely fantastic. It's made up of police, social workers, nurses, doctors, and some high-end researchers in Canada who have been, and government, who have been more than helpful. Why the definition really matters is an extremely important issue that most of us forget. And like, I listen to all these really excellent studies, and I think, why does this matter? It matters because it determines for all of us who is counted as mistreated and who isn't mistreated. It tells us who's at risk and who isn't at risk. The definition determines the legislation in terms of what it's going to cover and what it won't cover. And it determines ultimately who's eligible for service. So if you say the people have to be 65 years of age and over to be abused, you've already cut out anybody under that age. If you say sexual abuse doesn't matter, then we don't care about sexual abuse, and we don't have legislation, and we don't do anything about it. So the definition actually really matters. One of the biggest issues, I don't know, at the various meetings that you will go to, and I've been to a lot of meetings. The problem is my definition is better than your definition, and no, my definition's better than your, and away you go. And the problem is we go nowhere. So what we did is we did a literature review. We did a systematic review according to the Cochrane collaboration, and we took 4 major criteria for our review and to look at the definitions. And we took those studies where the target population was very clearly defined by inclusion and exclusion factors, that probability sampling was used, the data collection was standardized, and the measurements were standardized. So when we look at, and I apologize to Ireland and New York, because we did this back in 2008, so we didn't have all this really great information. When you look at domestic abuse, we found 13 really good studies worldwide. And if you look at the range on the very bottom, 0.8 to 18% in Israel, that's quite a widespread. In terms of institutional abuse, we found 9 studies. And again, if you look at the bottom, the range is enormous. when we looked at the definitions in all of the studies, they were enormous too. There was an enormous variation. We reviewed the legislation in Canada because we wanted to align the legal definitions with the social definitions so that we could cover the waterfront and that the legal profession could also use this data to their advantage in Canada. And what we really found in the legal definitions was that we found definitions around being in care or in need of protection, support or assistance. We found issues around decision making about finances and health. We found definitions. Domestic abuse is very big. Women abuse has lots of attention in Canada, but not so much in elder abuse. And of course, as you just heard a few minutes ago, human and civil rights were a big issue. And our challenge was to put the two together. Okay. How we analyzed all the concepts for elder abuse is that first we looked at them analytically, and we looked at firstly the underlying theory. And I can tell you, out of all of the studies, there's very little theory, as in none. There was one study, and that was actually flight. What was the focus of the concept? The focus of the concept, the unit of analysis, what I mean is, was it the older person? Was it a proxy? Was it the nursing staff? Who was it? Who was studied? And the interesting thing about concepts is that they can include cause, means, or outcome, or all of it. So we looked to see cause, means, outcome, and how we classified all of those. And again, you've heard today about the trust relationship. We looked at all the studies in terms of whether or not the concept included trust. We looked at the underlying assumptions of some of the concepts. And if you look at some of the concepts, the underlying assumption is caregiver stress. Yet we do not have a lot of proof for that theory either. Or that model. We then looked at the exact variable used, so it would be sexual abuse. We then looked at the indicators that were used to measure the variables, and then we looked at the actual questions in the questionnaire. And that's how we got down to the whole point that there's a lot of definitional disarray out there, which you all know. And it makes sense that there is, because there are so many perspectives out there that matter, and every perspective has different needs. We talk about connotative, and a connotative definition would be the WHO definition, which is quite broad, quite generic, and you can fit quite a lot of stuff under that one. The denotive one is more specific, and the structural one is the one that you will likely find in the law, something that contravenes a standard in your community or your society. Total lack of uniformity, as you've seen earlier here, in terms of the categories. Do you include sexual abuse? Do you include abandonment? Do you include not being allowed to see your grandchildren, which the first Canadian study included as a form of abuse? There's also a big lack of clarity within the categories, and that's when I was telling you you can have causes, behaviors, and outcomes, or combinations thereof. The most common definitions we found were the WHO, the National Research Council, an old one from the 1980s from Hudson in the USA, Canada. This is a great name you'll never forget, Putty Bungie in Canada, and Abora from Spain. And the Irish one and the British one were using the WHO definition. So what the whole research team meant, and they compared and looked for the common themes of all the definitions. But how did they make the decision? How they made the decisions of what they were going to use was that, number one, it had to be cross-national in terms of being able to compare. Secondly, because Canada is a huge country with 10 provinces and 3 territories, we had to be able to compare across Canada. And we had to be able to compare in different languages in Canada because we speak French and we speak English. We wanted to be future-oriented to newer mistreatment issues. And so we looked at things like cyber abuse. We wanted to be able to contract and expand the definitions as the British study and the Irish study can do. And that means you can say 10 to 15 times, or you could say severe. And so that you can expand it out to more detail or just have an overarching measure. We wanted to be able to do statistical analyses, so we needed some real measures. And one of the things that we thought we would do in Canada was append it to another national study, such as a general social survey or the new Canadian longitudinal study on aging, which has just started last year. We wanted also, we just wanted the world, because we have nothing better to do in Canada. It's so cold. Anyway, what we also wanted to do is to be able to provide a framework for qualitative research as well. Because whenever you say the word prevalence, people's eyes glaze over and they say, why aren't you doing qualitative research? But we need it all. And then we got our definitions after we met all those criteria. And I'm not going to go through them all. I would like to say I'm not, and they're in English and French too. One of the big issues for us is to make sure it's the same in both languages. That's very important. And in fact, Marie Bellew can speak to that at some time. Some of the emerging definitions, as I say, that we looked at was the rights definition and spiritual cultural abuse and the cyber abuse, but we didn't get very far on that. We did the whole thing all over again for risk and for the measurement instruments that were used. And we ended up, we went as low as you can go, age 55. I'm over age 55. Anyway, age 55. Because you want to be able to include as many people as possible to compare with as many countries as possible. English or French speaking, cognitively alert we had to do, but I will tell you we developed proxy interviews for the institution. And what we also included in our study, because we wanted to be able to predict, because it's a pilot study, we included those who have been mistreated and those who haven't been mistreated, so that we can now see through statistics if we can really predict or not. And because Canada is hugely ethnic, we have 232 different nationalities in Toronto alone. We took First Nations, absolutely important, South Asians, Chinese, and blacks, which are Caribbean and African blacks, because they are the most likely to immigrate to Canada. Westat developed the whole thing, but what I'm just going to quit there because it's almost coffee. It's 5 minutes. Oh, well, I did really well. What I want to say that we did that really matters is that we held a consensus day. After the team developed the definitions, we had a consensus meeting of 80 stakeholders across Canada, of practitioners in the police, social work, in every different service, in healthcare, nursing, geriatricians, etc. And we did a 2-day workshop together to try and come to some type of consensus around these definitions. So that, truthfully, for 2 days we worked really hard in different groups around, like more people were interested in sexual abuse that were interested in physical abuse, and they formed groups around those. They worked together, they came back, they argued, they fought, they had disagreements, and they came up with consensus definitions that are very close. They're in this, you can go back and read them if you really want. They're very similar to everybody else's, but they're Canadian made. Anyway, people agreed, which is what really mattered. And we spent a lot of time working on that agreement. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to go out, we're interviewing, we've done cognitive testing, 10 in Quebec, 30 in English-speaking Canada. We found out some really interesting things that it sort of hit on today. One of the first things was people cannot remember how many times they were psychologically abused. They kept telling us that. And the other thing I might mention, we ran focus groups with older adults as well, and they kept telling us, I can't remember how many times I was psychologically abused. They had a real problem with that. The other problem they had was we asked them about addictions, but we didn't ask about general mental health, and they really wanted mental health in there. And in fact, they also wanted gambling. I don't think we're putting gambling in, but we certainly have adjusted around the cognitive testing to put those factors in. And so what we're going to do is do some type of measure of nothing minimal and severe, and then still ask how many times. Because if we don't ask how many times, we're not going to be able to compare with anybody else. And we're hoping that might jog people's thinking to remember? I don't know. We're going to find that out. But the final part of all, once we've done all the interviews, done the regressions, all of those terrible logistic regressions, we are then going to have another consensus meeting in Canada with all the people again to go back over what we found and to hone our definitions again for the final time so that we could all start to use the same type of definition so that we can quit having 100 different studies that are totally unrelated to each other. And that ends the story. Coffee, okay? I tried.
Well, our speakers were so good, we're actually 15 minutes ahead of ourselves. So, can we show?
You can put these on the website.
So just before you break for coffee.
I should have this study. I did. Okay, I really.
Okay. Before we break for coffee, and since it may not be ready for us yet, I would like to play for you the video that we had thought we might begin with, but I think makes more sense to show you now. It's a 5-minute video that Elizabeth Podnick recorded. And what I want to draw your attention to is that in it, she will mention some new projects that have gone on in the last couple of years and that have evolved from some of our World Elder Abuse Awareness Days. And one of those is a project that has to do with a kit that was prepared for school children, for teenagers to use as a means of raising their awareness.
Good morning. It is an enormous pleasure for me to bring greetings to the 6th Annual World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and I thank President Gutmann for this opportunity. Congratulations to everyone who was involved in mounting this superb program. I wish I was there, but I am with you in thought and spirit. When we look back on the growth of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day and think of New York and the UN, June 15th, 2006, we think of the energy, the excitement, the creativity that was generated on that day and how we have moved forward and taken our dream, our vision, our blueprint to the world, and the world has responded. And this is seen in the many projects, initiatives, activities, and research that are now taking place across all nations. I particularly want to mention the involvement now of children and youth who have captured the imagination of the world with their activities as advocates for older people and developing awareness of elder abuse. The social network has been revolutionary in terms of our work and taking our projects and our ideas across the country and globe. The social network has enabled us to communicate with people everywhere and to share our materials, which is so vital in developing countries. Research, which was sparse when we started this project 6 years ago, has now proliferated and is taking place in nearly every country in the world. We are all searching for the answer to the universal question, why do people abuse? Research is reflected in activities on a daily basis as well as initiatives within universities and communities. We have learned the value of partnerships. We have seen the development of friendships from unlikely places, and we have become part of the global community. In the past 6 years, we have all changed. The world has changed, but the timeless concept of World Elder Abuse Day has miraculously continued to bloom and grow. So today, as you celebrate, recognize, and commemorate World Elder Abuse Day, remember to have fun, and also remember that it's not too soon to think about a spectacular 2012. Thank you, and safe home.